October 14th, 1943. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler couldn't believe what he was seeing. The American bomber, a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, had no right to be in the air, no right to exist. It was an obscenity against the laws of physics, a flying contradiction that defied everything Stigler knew about aerodynamics, engineering, and survival. The entire nose was gone. Just gone, blown away by flak, leaving a gaping wound through which Stigler could see daylight, could see the pilot struggling with controls, could see the navigator covered in blood, trying to hold maps that kept flying out through the missing plexiglass. The tail section was shredded, fabric stripped away, control surfaces hanging by cables, the tail gunner's position destroyed so thoroughly that Stigler couldn't tell if anyone was still inside. 3 of the 4 engines were either dead or trailing smoke. The right wing had a hole in it large enough to drive a Volkswagen through. And yet, the bomber kept flying. Not limping, not barely staying aloft, flying. Maintaining altitude, maintaining course, the remaining engine roaring defiance at gravity and logic and the entire Luftwaffe. Stigler pulled his Messerschmitt Bf 109 alongside the crippled bomber, close enough to see the pilot's face through the shattered cockpit. The American was young, maybe 22, 23. His oxygen mask was torn. Blood ran down his face from a scalp wound. His hands gripped the control yoke so tightly his knuckles had turned white. He turned his head and met Stigler's eyes. And Stigler saw something in that moment that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Not fear, not desperation, determination. The kind of absolute, stubborn, irrational determination that said, "I'm not done yet. This plane isn't dead until I say it's dead." Stigler had killed 47 Allied aircraft. He was an ace, a professional. He knew what a doomed plane looked like, knew the moment when a crew gave up, when the physics won and the machine began its final dive toward the earth. This wasn't that moment. This plane, this impossible, shattered, bleeding wreck of metal and fire, refused to die. Stigler's finger rested on the trigger. 1 burst. 3 seconds of cannon fire. That's all it would take to finish what the flak had started. But he couldn't do it. Because in that moment, watching that American pilot fight his dying bomber through the sky with nothing but willpower and stubbornness, Stigler realized something that shook him to his core. We're not winning this war. Not because of tactics, not because of numbers, because the Americans built machines that refused to die and trained men who didn't know how to quit. Stigler pulled his throttle back, gave the American pilot a salute that the bleeding, oxygen-starved young man probably didn't even see, and turned his Messerschmitt Bf 109 away. He watched the B-17 limp toward the horizon, trailing smoke and debris, defying every law of aviation. He watched it until it disappeared into the clouds. And then he went home and wrote in his diary, "Today I saw a ghost, a metal ghost that should have been dead but refused to accept it. God help us all." To understand what Franz Stigler witnessed that day, we need to go back to 1935. Boeing Aircraft Company, Seattle, Washington. The Boeing Model 299, which would become the B-17 Flying Fortress, was designed with one philosophy in mind: survivability. Not speed, not maneuverability, not even bombing accuracy. Survivability. The chief designer, a brilliant engineer named Edward Curtis Wells, understood something that would take the rest of the world years to grasp. In modern aerial warfare, it doesn't matter how fast or maneuverable your bomber is if it can't survive long enough to drop its payload and get home. So Wells designed the B-17 with redundancy built into every system. 4 engines. The plane could fly on 2. Limp home on 1. Multiple fuel tanks. Lose 3, the 4th keeps you airborne. Dual hydraulic systems. One fails, the backup takes over. And perhaps most importantly, a structural design that distributed stress across the entire airframe. The B-17 wasn't built like a traditional aircraft with critical load-bearing structures that would fail catastrophically if damaged. It was built like a bridge, with multiple load paths that could compensate if one was destroyed. The result was a bomber that could absorb punishment that would obliterate any other aircraft of its era. But even Wells didn't realize just how resilient his creation would prove to be. By 1942, B-17 production had been refined to an art form. Boeing was producing one complete bomber every 90 minutes. The assembly line ran 24 hours a day. Workers, many of them women who'd never touched an aircraft before, were building the most technologically advanced bomber in the world, with precision that would have been impossible just years earlier. Each B-17 contained 103,000 individual parts, 13 miles of electrical wiring, 1,100 pounds of aluminum rivets, 4 1,200 horsepower Wright Cyclone engines, defensive armament, 13.5 caliber machine guns, maximum bomb load, 8,000 pounds, crew, 10 men. The B-17E and subsequent models featured a tailgun position that eliminated the bomber's previous blind spot. The nose was reinforced with additional plexiglass. The oxygen system was upgraded. The armor plating around crew positions was increased. But the real innovation was invisible. The airframe itself, the skeleton of aluminum alloy and steel, was designed using principles that wouldn't become mainstream in civilian aviation for another 30 years. Fail-safe design, damage tolerance, redundant load paths. Boeing engineer William Patterson explained it in a 1943 technical memo. The B-17 airframe is designed so that catastrophic failure of any single structural element will not result in immediate loss of the aircraft. Critical structures incorporate multiple load paths. If primary structures are damaged or destroyed, secondary structures automatically assume the load. The aircraft may be severely compromised, may lose significant capability, but it will remain controllable and in most cases capable of returning to base. In engineering terms, this was revolutionary. In practical terms, it meant American bomber crews had a chance to survive when everything went wrong. And in the skies over Germany in 1943, everything went wrong constantly. The first time German pilots really understood what they were facing came during the Regensburg-Schweinfurt raids, some of the bloodiest air battles in history. 291 B-17s took off from England. Their mission? Destroy ball bearing factories in Regensburg and Schweinfurt, deep inside Germany. The factories were critical to German war production. Destroying them would cripple German tank and aircraft manufacturing. But it required the bombers to fly 450 miles into German territory through the heaviest concentration of anti-aircraft guns and fighter bases in Europe, without fighter escort for most of the journey. It was a suicide mission. The Germans knew they were coming. Hauptmann Johannes Mackie Steinhoff was already in the cockpit of his Focke-Wulf FW-19 when the alarm sounded. He was 29 years old, an ace with 96 confirmed kills, and he'd been fighting the American bomber streams since they started coming in strength 6 months earlier. He thought he understood them. The Americans flew in tight formations. Combat boxes of 18 to 27 bombers, arranged so their defensive machine guns created interlocking fields of fire. Attacking them head-on was dangerous but possible. Hit the lead bomber, disrupt the formation, pick off stragglers. Standard tactics, proven tactics. What Steinhoff didn't understand, what none of the German pilots understood yet, was that the B-17 could survive attacks that would destroy any other bomber. His squadron intercepted the American formation at 10:15, 90 miles inside German territory. Angriff, attack. Steinhoff dove through the formation, guns blazing. He saw his rounds impact a B-17 in the second wave, saw the nose plexiglass explode, saw the number 2 engine burst into flames, saw pieces of aluminum skin peel away from the fuselage. The bomber should have fallen out of formation, should have begun its death spiral. Instead, it maintained position. The burning engine was feathered, the formation closed around it protectively. Steinhoff came around for another pass. This time, he focused on a different B-17, raking it from nose to tail with 20mm cannon fire. He counted at least 7 hits on the wings, 4 on the fuselage. One engine was definitely destroyed. The bomber stayed in formation. Third pass. He targeted the tail section of another B-17, trying to take out the tail gunner. His rounds shredded the tail surfaces, tearing away fabric and control cables. The bomber flew on. Was zum Teufel? What the hell? Steinhoff had been in aerial combat for 3 years. He'd fought over France, England, Russia. He'd killed Spitfires, Hurricanes, Yaks, P-2s. He knew how to destroy aircraft. But these American bombers weren't dying the way they were supposed to. He made 6 attack runs that day. On each pass, he scored hits. On each pass, he watched bombers absorb damage that should have been fatal and continue flying. By the time his ammunition was exhausted and he had to return to base, the American formation, reduced in number but still organized, was approaching its target. Steinhoff landed, climbed out of his cockpit, and lit a cigarette with shaking hands. His wingman, Feldwebel Karl-Heinz Weber, walked over. "Did you see them? Did you see those bombers?" "I saw them," Steinhoff said quietly. "I put 300 rounds into one. 300! It kept flying. How is that possible?" Steinhoff didn't answer. He didn't have an answer. He just stood there, smoking, watching the sky, and wondering what kind of machines the Americans had built. While German pilots were struggling to comprehend what they were seeing, the American crews inside the B-17s were fighting for their lives. Captain Robert Morgan, pilot of the Memphis Belle, one of the most famous B-17s of the war, later described what it was like. You'd feel the plane shudder when flak hit. Sometimes you'd hear it, a metallic crack that meant shrapnel had penetrated somewhere. The German fighters would come at you from 12 o'clock high, their cannons flashing, and you'd brace yourself for the impacts. I remember one mission where we took a 20mm round through the number 3 engine, just punched right through it. The engine seized up, started trailing smoke. We feathered it, shut it down to reduce drag. Lost the engine, but the plane kept flying, no problem. Another time, flak took out our entire hydraulic system. We couldn't lower the landing gear, couldn't operate the bomb bay doors, had to manually crank everything. It took 30 minutes and every bit of strength we had, but we got it done. Dropped our bombs on target, flew home. The Germans couldn't understand it. Hell, sometimes we couldn't understand it. You'd look back and see your tail section held on by what looked like 2 pieces of wire and a prayer, and the plane was still flying straight and level. It didn't make sense, but we learned to trust it. We learned that the fort could take it, could take anything they threw at us and still bring us home. This wasn't bravado. This wasn't propaganda. This was the lived experience of American bomber crews discovering that their aircraft was tougher than anyone, including its designers, had anticipated. One of the most detailed German perspectives on B-17 resilience comes from Wilhelm Schoenen, a Luftwaffe night fighter ace who later published his wartime diary. His October 14, 1943 entry, the same day Franz Stigler encountered the crippled B-17, provided crucial insight. In Jonin's diary entry, he describes intercepting an American bomber formation today at high altitude. His radar operator, Male, guided us into position perfectly. The Americans were in their standard combat box, staggered formation, all guns pointing outward like a metal hedgehog. I selected a bomber on the edge of the formation. Classic tactics: hit the stragglers, avoid the concentrated firepower of the center. Came in from below and behind where their defensive fire is weakest. Opened up with all 4 cannons at 200 meters range. I watched my rounds impact the bomber's belly. I saw the explosions. I saw pieces fly off. The bomber should have exploded, should have fallen, but it didn't. It absorbed my fire like a sponge absorbing water. I had to break off because their return fire was too heavy. As I dove away, I looked back. The bomber I'd hit was still in formation, still flying, apparently undamaged. How? How is this possible? I've fought Russian bombers, Tupolev TB-3s, Petlyakov PE-2s. They go down with a few good hits. I've fought British Lancasters and Halifaxes. They're tough, but they die when you hit them hard enough. These American bombers don't die. They absorb punishment that would destroy 2 or 3 German aircraft and keep flying. It's not natural. It's not right. The propaganda tells us the Americans are soft, that their machines are inferior, that they lack the warrior spirit. But propaganda doesn't explain what I saw today. Propaganda doesn't explain how a bomber with 2 engines destroyed, half its tail shot away, and holes you could throw a football through can maintain formation and complete its mission. I'm starting to think we've been lied to. As 1943 turned into 1944, specific incidents of B-17 survivability began to circulate among both American and German pilots. These stories took on mythic proportions, some exaggerated, some understated, all pointing to the same conclusion. The Flying Fortress earned its name. The story of Old Bill became legendary in bomber circles. During a raid on Bremen, Old Bill, piloted by Lieutenant Owen Baggett, took a direct flak hit that destroyed the entire nose section. The bombardier and navigator were killed instantly. The explosion tore away everything forward of the pilot's position, leaving Baggett and his co-pilot exposed to 200-mile-per-hour winds at 25,000 feet. The temperature was minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Baggett couldn't see. The wind was so strong it physically pinned him against his seat. His oxygen mask was ripped away. He was suffocating, freezing, and blind, while flying a bomber that had lost its entire forward fuselage. By all logic, he should have ordered the crew to bail out. Instead, he fought. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Robert Williams, managed to wedge himself into a position where he could shield Baggett from some of the wind. The flight engineer, Staff Sergeant Marcus Johnson, crawled forward and physically held Baggett's oxygen mask in place with his hands. For 90 minutes they flew like that. No instruments, those had been destroyed with the nose section. No bombardier to help navigate. Just Baggett, half frozen and oxygen-starved, flying by instinct and feel alone. The B-17 stayed in the air. When they finally crossed back into Allied territory and Baggett brought Old Bill down for an emergency landing, ground crews stood in stunned silence. The bomber had no nose. The cockpit was destroyed. Ice covered every surface. By all reasonable assessment, the aircraft should have been uncontrollable. But Baggett had controlled it. And the B-17's airframe, despite losing 20% of its total structure, had remained stable enough to fly. A German pilot who later saw photographs of Old Bill wrote in his journal, "I don't believe these pictures are real. No aircraft can fly in this condition. The Americans must be using trick photography for propaganda purposes, because if these pictures are real, then we have no hope of winning this war." The pictures were real. Ruthie II's story illustrates another aspect of B-17 resilience: the ability to absorb catastrophic damage to individual systems and continue operating. During a raid on Oschersleben, Ruthie 2 was hit by flak that severed all 4 main hydraulic lines. This meant no brake pressure, no landing gear extension, no bomb bay door operation, no turret operation, no flap control. In most aircraft, this would mean immediate abandonment, but the B-17 had manual backup systems for critical functions. The crew manually cranked down the landing gear using an emergency hand pump, 300 turns of a crank handle, requiring 2 men working in shifts. They manually opened the bomb bay doors using mechanical override cables. They dropped their bombs on target. Then they flew 400 miles back to England with no hydraulics, manually maintaining trim using emergency controls. The landing was done without brakes or flaps. Ruthie 2 touched down at 120 miles per hour, 40 miles per hour faster than normal, and rolled off the end of the runway into a muddy field. The aircraft was repairable. The crew was uninjured. Lieutenant Colonel Hans-Joachim Jobs, a German fighter ace who later reviewed the incident report, captured after the war, wrote in the margin, "Impossible. This did not happen. If it did happen, then our intelligence reports about American aircraft capabilities are completely wrong."
They were completely wrong. What made the B-17 so resilient? Why could it absorb damage that would destroy other aircraft? The answer lies in engineering decisions made years before the war began. Structural redundancy. The B-17's wing structure contained not 1, but 3 separate load-bearing spars. Most aircraft of the era used a single main spar. If it failed, the wing failed. The B-17's 3-spar design meant that even if one spar was completely destroyed, the other 2 could carry the load. German engineer Kurt Tank, designer of the FW-190, examined a captured B-17 in 1944. His report stated, "The American design philosophy is fundamentally different from ours. We build aircraft to be as light and efficient as possible. We remove every gram of excess weight. The Americans do the opposite. They add weight for survivability. They over-engineer everything. The result is an aircraft that performs adequately but survives extraordinarily. In retrospect, their approach may be superior for heavy bombers in contested airspace." Self-sealing fuel tanks. The B-17's fuel tanks were lined with layers of rubber that would automatically seal around bullet holes. When punctured, the rubber would swell on contact with fuel, plugging the hole within seconds. This technology wasn't unique to the B-17, but the implementation was superior. American self-sealing tanks could handle multiple punctures. German fighters would put dozens of rounds into a B-17's fuel tanks and watch in frustration as the aircraft continued flying, fuel barely trickling from the holes before they sealed. The B-17 had 2 complete electrical systems, 2 complete oxygen systems, and multiple fuel feed systems. Damage to one system wouldn't disable the aircraft. Lieutenant Friedrich Lang, who flew against B-17s throughout 1944, described his frustration. "You would destroy an engine, the bomber flies on 3. You would destroy 2 engines, it flies on 2. You destroy the hydraulics, they operate manually. You sever the control cables, they have backup cables. You kill half the crew, the survivors do double duty. There is no single point of failure. No kill shot. You must literally destroy the entire aircraft piece by piece, and even then, it might make it home." The maintenance crews had their own perspective on B-17 resilience. Technical Sergeant Mike Romano, crew chief for the 91st Bomb Group, "We'd see planes come back that had no business being in the air. I remember one fort, I think it was Liberty Bell, came back with a hole in the right wing so big 3 of us could stand inside it. The wing's main spar was cracked halfway through. By all engineering logic, that wing should have folded during landing. But it didn't. The secondary structure held. We patched it, reinforced the spar, and the plane was flying again 3 days later. Another time, a plane landed with the entire tail section twisted 15 degrees off-center. The pilot said they'd been hit by a German fighter that came straight through their formation, actually collided with their tail, and somehow didn't bring them down. The tail was so damaged, we thought we'd have to scrap the whole bird. But engineering said no. They calculated that the main fuselage structure was intact. They straightened the tail, replaced the damaged sections, and the plane flew another 40 missions. The German planes, the 109s, the 190s, they were beautiful aircraft, elegant, efficient, but they were fragile. We'd capture them sometimes, examine them. One good hit, and they came apart. They were built for speed and maneuverability, not survival. The fort was built different. It was built to take punishment. And it did. Day after day, mission after mission, it took everything the Germans could throw at it and brought our boys home. By mid-1944, the psychological toll on German fighter pilots was becoming severe. It wasn't just that they were outnumbered, though they were. It wasn't just that American fighter escorts were getting better, though they were. It was the grinding, demoralizing experience of putting everything you had into attacking a bomber, scoring dozens of hits, and watching it continue flying. Noak was one of the most reflective German pilots, and his diary provides crucial insight into the psychological state of the Luftwaffe. May 8, 1944. We intercepted a large American formation today. Over 500 bombers. 500! When I joined the Luftwaffe in 1939, we would have considered 50 bombers a major raid. I made 3 attack runs. Each time I hit my target. Each time the bombers stayed in formation. On my final pass, I focused all fire on a single B-17, trying to destroy it completely. I saw my cannon shells explode along its fuselage. I saw pieces fly off. I saw smoke. The bomber didn't even leave formation. After I landed, I sat in my cockpit for 10 minutes, unable to move. What's the point? What's the point of risking our lives, expending ammunition, if the enemy simply absorbs everything and continues?
The new pilots, the boys they're sending us now with barely 30 hours of flight time, they don't understand yet. They still believe the propaganda. They think the Americans are inferior, that we're superior. But those of us who've been fighting since 1943, we know different. We know we're losing. Not because we're not brave, not because we're not skilled, but because the Americans have built machines that won't die and trained crews that won't quit. Today, I shot down a B-17. Finally, it took all my ammunition and 6 attack runs, but I got it. I watched it fall, watched the crew bail out, 4 parachutes. 6 men stayed with the plane. Whether by choice or because they couldn't escape, I don't know. I felt nothing. No satisfaction. No pride. Just exhaustion. Because I know that tomorrow, another B-17 will take its place. And another. And another. They have an endless supply. We don't. How do you win a war against an enemy that can replace losses faster than you can inflict them, using aircraft that refuse to die? You don't. You just hold on and hope for a miracle. After D-Day, German fighter units were pulled from Western Front defense to try to stop the Allied advance through France. This gave American bombers temporary respite. But the damage to German fighter pilot morale was already done. General Major Adolf Galland, commander of German fighter forces, wrote in his post-war memoir, "By mid-1944, our pilots had lost faith, not in themselves,
They were still skilled, still brave, but in victory. They'd seen too many certain kills fly away. They'd emptied their guns into American bombers and watched them continue to their targets. It played a powerful psychological effect. A pilot needs to believe his weapons are effective. When that belief is shaken, when he starts to doubt whether anything he does matters, he's already defeated. The B-17 didn't just survive our attacks, it broke our spirit. Perhaps the most extraordinary footnote to this story came decades after the war ended. Franz Stigler, the German pilot who'd encountered the crippled B-17 on October 14, 1943, over Germany, had emigrated to Canada after the war. He'd become a successful businessman, married, raised a family. He'd never told anyone about that day, about the decision he'd made not to shoot down the helpless American bomber. In 1989, he saw a letter in a military aviation magazine. The letter was from Charles Brown, an American B-17 pilot searching for the German fighter pilot who'd spared his life on October 14, 1943, over Germany.
Stiegler's hands shook as he read the description, the date, the location, the details that matched his memory perfectly. He called the number in the letter. "Charlie Brown?" he said when a voice answered. "Yes. This is Franz Stiegler. I was the German pilot." Silence on the line. Then, You let us go. Why?" "Because you were already dead," Stiegler said quietly. "Your plane, it had no right to be flying. You had no weapons left. Half your crew was wounded. Shooting you down would have been murder, not combat." They talked for 3 hours that first call. Then they arranged to meet. The meeting was emotional. 2 old men, once enemies, embracing in an airport. Brown's eyes were wet. "You saved my life," he said.